Imagine it's Christmas Eve and you're outside. In the distance, you can hear the faint cry of a woman as she's being stabbed to death by her husband. Hi weirdos, welcome back. If you're joining us for the first time, thanks for stopping by. Oh my god, I didn't have record on for like that whole thing. I'm Tracy, gonna try something a little bit different. Well, another day, another outfit. There was a murder in my family, and it's something that I've wanted to do for the last year or two. Not murdering, I've not wanted to try murdering, I've wanted to try to do a video about the murdering. But I've been a little nervous, not really my typical type of video. I really feel like it goes without saying that I'm not an internet sleuth. I don't really deep dive into things. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I have no idea how to do this. Most of my information that I have has come from my family tree and from actual conversations with my family members. If a well-known person did this, maybe somebody who knew what the flip they were doing, I couldn't even find a picture of him. I found one picture of him. So with that being said, put on your outside shoes, grab yourself a snack to go because we're heading back to Georgia to 1875, September 22nd. Oh golly, Tracy, why is that? That is the day that my great-great-grandfather Rufus Bird was born. He was born to the parents Zachariah Taylor Bird and Julia Reeves. So because it was the 1800s, there wasn't a lot of information about Rufus's childhood. There was no social media or anything that I could go back and look on to. Kids back then didn't have TikToks and Facebooks that they were constantly updating. But we do know he was born in Hall, Georgia, and eventually Rufus grew up into a man and met, fell in love with, and married a woman by the name of Fanny Spivey. Fanny Spivey was born November 14th, 1878, and her mother's name was Narcissus, and her father's name was Wesley. Narcissus? And they lived together in Parker, Texas. Texas is super squared. You guys see that? Rufus and Fanny, they got together and they tied the knot in November of 1896. And after that, they bought a little house in Decatur, Georgia on Cherokee Avenue. I know their last name's Bird, but I can't help but think that maybe it should be Rabbits because they immediately had children, specifically 10 children. And their names are, in order, Raymond, Renee, Minnie, Thomas, Ivy Lee, Myrtle, Bertie, Bonnie, Hugh, and lastly, little baby boy William, who was born in 1922. There was a ton of other cool stuff going on in 1922. The Supreme Court chose to defend the 19th Amendment, which is the woman's right to vote. The Storm of 1922. The Storm of 1922 was a huge snowstorm that happened in Washington in January, and it dropped like 28 inches of snow in 48 hours. And so much snow accumulated that it actually collapsed their beloved Knickerbocker Theater, injuring 133 people and claiming the lives of 98 more, along with the name of the theater itself, forever going down in history as the Knickerbocker Storm of 22. Entrance to King Tut's tomb was finally found by Howard Carter from Britain and his archaeological crew. But unfortunately, we're not talking about any of those things today. Yeah, I guess we kind of did, didn't we? I was not able to find a lot of information about the Bird family household. It was pretty well known that Rufus was pretty notorious for not treating the female members of his family so kind. Again, I ran into issues finding information about this because the websites wanted money in order to continue, which I just wasn't willing to do at this point. But I did find this newspaper article from 1912 that states that he had to pay a fine due to an assault, which means that he pled guilty or was found guilty of it. Shortly after that, August 22nd in 1918, Rufus got caught with whiskey and again was arrested. I hear what you're saying. It being 1918, Rufus would be old enough to drink, so what's the problem? Prohibition! Georgia was actually one of the first states to ban the transportation and sale of whiskey. And so that was the problem. It was just that he just physically had the whiskey. Georgia was so hardcore about this alcohol ban that they kept it in place for 2 years after it was nationally lifted. 2 years! They kept it in place until 1935. Rufus paid the fine for that, and life went on as normal. At this time, most of his kids were like between the ages of 11 and like 16. Can we really judge the man for wanting a little bit of whiskey? I'm not saying murder is the answer. I'm just saying I can understand the stress of it. Because Rufus always paid these fines instead of going to jail, it leads me to believe that while maybe they weren't rich, they led a comfortable life because he was able to pay the fine. So now we flash forward to 1922, and the Byrds' oldest children are now adults and living on their own with their own families. And one of those grown children now just happened to be their daughter, Minnie. And that is where our story takes place today, at Minnie's home. At some point, it was decided between Fanny and Minnie that Fanny, along with two of her younger children, Bonnie, who was about 13, and little William, who was maybe a few months old, would go to Minnie's house and spend some Christmas Eve time together, having tea and chit-chatting as mothers will do. It's said that after an undisclosed amount of time, Rufus just showed up. From what I understand, he wasn't actually invited. He just showed up unannounced. There will actually be more on this in a little bit. He was in a fine mood. There was no red flags. He didn't seem angry or agitated. He just simply showed up unannounced. After Rufus had been there for a little while, completely uninvited, he asked Fanny and Minnie to cook him something to eat. I could think of a few things I could shove down that guy's throat right now. After they were done eating, it said that Rufus stood up and asked Fanny if he could hold their son William. William, just being an infant and born earlier that year, it would be easy to assume that he needed assistance with his feedings and that Fanny was already holding him in her lap. That's why Rufus had to ask for him as opposed to just picking him up. So Fanny handed William to Rufus. So it's at this point where Rufus throws his infant son on the ground and pulls out an ice pick that he had hidden somewhere on his body. He then takes this ice pick and starts stabbing at Minnie. That is some top-notch parenting choices right there. Using your infant child as a shield. He used his child as a shield while he stabbed his other child. Rufus then stopped and turned his attention to his wife, Fanny. Minnie, young Bonnie, and even younger William could do nothing but watch in horror as their father stabbed their mother to death in front of them. Hold on to your hats. Doesn't stop there, folks. After he was done with Fanny, he then took the ice pick and turned it upon himself. When I say ice pick, this is what I mean. It's like a literal pick with a little wooden handle on it, and they were super, super common in the 20s. Most households still had the ice pick. They were crazy, crazy common. It's really weird that Rufus was just running around with one shoved in his pants. I couldn't find anywhere where it said exactly what his injury was, but he did require medical attention. The ambulance and the police were called. Minnie's hand was addressed and dressed. Tragically, there was nothing that could be done to save Fanny. She lay there on her daughter's dining room floor, surrounded by her crying children and her own blood. Fanny Lee Byrd was pronounced dead December 24th, 1922, cause of death, murder. It was shortly determined by the medical staff at the hospital that Mr. Byrd's injuries to himself were in fact non-life-threatening, and it would be okay and safe for him to go on with trial. Backfire, buddy, dang! On March 12th, the trial started for Rufus and Fanny Byrd, with Fanny and Minnie's lawyers claiming that this was obviously a premeditated murder, with Rufus following Fanny to Minnie's house with his own murder weapon. It really didn't seem that poor Rufus had a leg to stand on. Oh yeah, plus there's this. Do you remember earlier when we talked about how it seemed that Rufus just showed up to Minnie's house uninvited? Well, it turns out that there was a reason for that. It seems that just a week prior to this incident, Fanny Byrd herself went down to the courthouse to get a warrant of the peace against her husband, Rufus. Warrant of the peace is a little bit different from a protection order. The person has been seen to be a threat to either them, someone else, or their property, enough so that they can immediately be arrested. I did read something very interesting while I was looking up the difference between a peace warrant and a protection order. And that is that peace warrants generally are granted to people who are not related to you, people that you are not in intimate relationships with. So it makes me wonder what the status of their relationship was at this point where she sought the peace warrant. Why was it a peace warrant and not a protection order? Were they already in the process of divorcing, and could this maybe have been a motive? There was already an active warrant to arrest Rufus because of a literal attempt he's already made on his wife's life. If he has all these warrants out on him, where is he staying? He obviously wasn't staying at home with Fanny because she surely would sound the alarms to have him served and arrested. So where was he? Nobody knows. It's literally not talked about. With all this evidence available, it did not take the jury long to find Rufus guilty of his crimes. I believe within 2 hours his verdict was handed down. Rufus Byrd was found guilty. He got the death penalty. He was sentenced to hang April 23rd. Now, Mr. Byrd, whether he deserved it or not, unfortunately had luck on his side. His lawyer was the former mayor of Georgia. He knew the ins and outs of the process. He knew the paperwork. He knew what he needed to do. He immediately put in for an appeal. Their defense, you know I heard you ask it, insanity. Rufus Byrd was now claiming that this was not an act of premeditation, that it was an act of insanity caused by ongoing bladder disease. So I real quick looked up some of the symptoms of this bladder disease, and this is what I found. Things like fever, discomfort, chills, confusion, mild aggravation. I didn't see murder, stabbing, plotting, revenge. This is literally their entire defense. They are grasping at straws. And it seemed that straws was all the jury was really looking for. They got together again, despite all of the evidence, a peace warrant order, the previous attack on Fanny's life, despite everything all the other children had to say. He followed her to Minnie's house, creepily in the shadows with his own ice pick, after already trying to kill her just a week earlier. Despite all of that, the jury got together and they said, you know what? That checks out. I could see how a bladder infection could be irksome. And they changed Rufus's sentence from death to life in prison. I guess he was still at least gonna rot in jail. Rufus Byrd passed away 1928. I could not find a cause of death. Maybe it was one of those bladder infections. They'll get you. And I guess that's pretty much it. If you stayed till the end, thank you so much. I do not intend to do this on a regular basis, but being my great-grandfather, it just hit a little close to home. It's my family, so why not give it a shot? Thanks for stopping by.